Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Sweden and Finland have both formally requested to become members of the NATO alliance. To admit new members to NATO requires the approval of all existing NATO members, and so far, Turkey is objecting. My guest today, Sibel Oktay, is Associate Professor at the University of Illinois Springfield and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We kick off with a discussion about Turkey's specific grievances with Sweden and, to a lesser extent, Finland, and then have a broader conversation about how this dust-up between Turkey and the rest of NATO fits into broader patterns in Turkish foreign policy. This includes an extended discussion of the unique role that Turkey is playing, on the one hand providing Ukraine with meaningful military assistance since the Russian invasion, and on the other hand not joining along with many Western sanctions on Russia. Sibel Oktay describes Turkey's policy towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a delicate balancing act, for reasons she explains. This episode was recorded just a few days before a major NATO summit in Madrid on June 27th, and I think this episode does a good job of giving you the background you need to understand both Turkey's approach to NATO enlargement and its foreign policy more generally. Big thank you to Sibel Oktay for coming back on the show. We last spoke a few months ago in the midst of this staggering meltdown in Turkey's economy, which, as she describes in this episode, is still ongoing. And please do reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org, or you can hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to your suggestions of topics I should cover as well. I produce this podcast for you, dear listener, so please reach out to me with whatever is on your mind. Thanks. All right, now here is my conversation with Sibel Oktay, Associate Professor at the University of Illinois at Springfield and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
So Sweden actually is the real target of Turkey's concerns. Sweden has for a long time provided refuge to political asylum seekers from Turkey, most notably Kurdish activists and those who Turkey considers members or supporters of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. It's a terrorist organization as listed by the US and the EU. And Turkey waged war against the PKK for the better part of 40 years. So in other words, Turkey argues that Sweden aids and abets the PKK. In addition to that, Sweden put a ban on arms export licenses to Turkey after 2019, when the Turkish military launched its offensive in northern Syria against the YPG. YPG is the People's Protection Units. Turkey considers a PKK offshoot and an instrumental military organization that fought against ISIS during the early period of the Syrian war.
And one that's supported by the United States as well.
Exactly. And so Sweden put a ban on these arms export licenses to prevent Turkey from using their material, the material that they sourced, to stop Kurdish expansion and territorial consolidation along that northern strip of Syria that borders Turkey. And so now Turkey and Erdogan and his spokesperson and chief advisor in foreign affairs, Ibrahim Kalın, they both argue that it's against the spirit of the alliance if a prospective member, say Sweden, opposes and undermines the legitimate national security concerns of another ally, in this case Turkey. So that's Sweden. But then there's also Finland, and Finland has kind of become the collateral damage in this narrative because, in fact, reports from Finnish sources explain that the Prime Minister, Sauli Niinisto, received full support from Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's president, previously back in early spring, before he reversed his position, did a 180, and put Finland alongside Sweden in that same basket of his veto. So with Finland, Turkey's key demand is the extradition of Gülenis. So Fethullah Gülen, this imam who has been living in Pennsylvania in the United States for the last couple of decades, he and his religious movement was a strong ally of the AKP and Erdogan's government for maybe 2 decades, when the alliance began to fall apart around 2012, and now Gülenis are considered a terrorist organization, and Gülen himself is considered to be the orchestrator and the key perpetrator of the failed coup in 2016.
And there's this whole sordid backstory from the Trump administration with the former and disgraced national security advisor, Michael Flynn, trying to seek the extradition of Gulen from Pennsylvania to Turkey. This has been long a target of Erdogan.
Absolutely. So whenever there is Gülenist, or in this case, Gülen himself, which you rightly pointed out, Turkey demands their extradition. And with Finland, Turkey is demanding the extradition of I think about a dozen people, including some of the Gülenists that they charge with terrorism. But the Finnish authorities argue that there is no legal basis for extradition and that they cannot violate the rule of law to meet Turkey's demands. And the same thing, obviously, the exact same argument is made by the United States when Turkey wants Gülen to be extradited. And also there are similar extradition requests that Turkey makes from Sweden, and Sweden gives the same response. Mm-hmm. Some of these people include sympathizers of PKK, but also Gülenists, and specifically some journalists who used to write in Gülenist newspapers in Turkey, but now reside in Sweden.
To what extent do you think that Erdogan's decision to kind of put the brakes on Sweden and Finland's ascension into NATO stems from domestic politics, that Turkey's economy is faltering, and this is an opportunity to sort of whip up nationalist sentiment ahead of elections next year?
I think that's exactly right. Last time I was on your show, we talked about the economic problems that Turkey was observing and experiencing. Those economic problems haven't gotten any better. In fact, I was just reading the news today about predictions about this summer's tourism estimates, and especially tourists from Russia are expected to plummet this year, which has serious economic consequences for the tourism industry. And so when we talk about Turkish foreign policy, especially during Erdogan's rule, we cannot separate that from Turkey's domestic politics. Everything he does on the international arena has some implication. It has some meaning for what he wants to achieve at the domestic level. He is preparing for elections in 2023. That's when they're scheduled, but there is always debates about whether he wants to call for early elections later this year. And this, he, along with the ongoing plans to continue the military operation in Syria, I think these will be two of his platforms when it comes to foreign affairs, and to divert and distract the public's increased frustration with the economic crisis. So I think you're absolutely right that this is something that he wants to play back home to his domestic audience.
So I think this dust-up with Sweden and Finland joining NATO is illustrative of the really kind of interesting and unique position that Turkey has played in regards to diplomacy with Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. I'd love, before we discuss how Turkey has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, could you maybe just kind of briefly situate Turkish foreign policy in the, years or months leading up to February 24th, 2022?
Absolutely. So Turkey is standing at a fascinating juncture between the West, the Euro-Atlantic security framework, and Russia. And that is, like you anticipate, it's fundamentally shaping its positioning vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. So first of all, we should start to situate Turkey, right? So Turkey is a member of the NATO alliance since 1952. One of the first, it was part of that first wave of expansion after the alliance was established. And it's the second largest contributor to NATO with nearly 500,000 troops. So so we are talking about a really noticeable, hefty ally in that organization. It's also led military operations in Kosovo and Afghanistan and various other multilateral military operations as part of the NATO alliance. And after the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan last summer, summer of 2021, Turkey had also proposed to operate Kabul airport. So Turkey, in that sense, has always been a deep and important, deeply entrenched member of the NATO alliance. Relatedly, Turkey and the United States used to be, I should say, very close allies. They used to call each other strategic partners throughout the Cold War and into the early 2000s. But then those relationships began to deteriorate sometime after 2013 with the Gezi protests, most noticeably.
And these were protests in Istanbul, if I'm remembering correctly, that were sort of against Erdogan, kind of anti-inequality protests. Am I misremembering?
Right. So they began over claims over Gezi Park to graze Gezi Park and build some commercial structures. And so the protests began to protect the park itself, but then they mushroomed and took the entire country. There were protests essentially in every single city across Turkey, and the key demands were greater democratic participation, greater rights and liberties, and an end to this sort of tyrannical rule over people's lives, and the central government basically micromanaging what's happening in a park in Istanbul. And so back then, around 2013 onwards, Turkey's democratic decay had become so much more apparent. There were disagreements between the US and Turkey about the war in Syria and how to engage and deal with ISIS. Obviously, there was this falling apart of a major defense deal between Turkey and the US. Turkey wanted to purchase the Patriot air defense system. That agreement didn't go through. And then that was what prompted Turkey to purchase the Russian equivalent of it, the S-400s.
Yeah, this was in 2018.
Exactly.
Yeah, this was a very big deal at the time when Turkey, a member of NATO, bought the non-compatible with NATO version of a missile defense system from Russia.
Right. I mean, it was non-compatible and it's straight up dangerous, right? It has the potential to reveal confidential mechanic details about NATO capabilities. And so Turkey's purchasing and finally bringing in the S-400s, but that not activating the hardware prompted the CAATSA sanctions from U.S. Congress. That's countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act. And then moving into the 2000s, 2020 and 2021, when President Biden was elected, it's well known that these two leaders aren't exactly fond of each other. And so the listeners might be following, Biden is preparing to take a visit to Israel later this summer, probably in July. And it's a 2-hour flight from Tel Aviv to Ankara. And Biden and the U.S. administration more broadly has been avoiding visiting Turkey in that kind of capacity since he became president.
And, to Erdogan's defense, Biden did himself little favor by forthrightly declaring the genocide in Armenia, which is like this, obviously a big domestic issue the Armenian genocide, which is a big domestic issue for Erdogan.
Absolutely. That's always been the litmus test between to understand where Turkey-U.S. relations lie, because presidents have always acted as a sort of an emergency brake when Congress wanted to pass that. And this time around, it wasn't opposed, and then it passed. But then there's the Russian side of it. And Turkey also has these relations with Russia that helps us place Turkey back in this sort of chessboard over the Ukraine war. Turkey is a major trade partner to Russia. Turkey purchases natural gas from Russia and exports agricultural products. And in 2021, we're talking about $30 billion US. So it's a pretty large trade volume we're talking about. Like I said before, Turkey also attracts millions of Russian tourists each year. In fact, prior to the pandemic in 2019, the total number of Russian tourists that visited Turkey was 7 million. And then right after the pandemic in 2021, the number was 4.7 million. So basically half of that. And then right now, forecasters are expecting about 2 million, and they're saying that that's even a very optimistic estimate. So we're seeing Russian tourists for all sorts of reasons, but particularly, obviously, for security and political reasons, are not choosing to come to Turkey, which has severe implications for the economy. And so that's the economic side. And with the more security side, obviously, Turkey's purchasing of the S-400s and the coordinated behaviors of Russia and Turkey in Syria also make them strange bedfellows, if you want to call it that way. And that's the difficult position. That's the complex situation that Turkey found themselves in when the war broke in February.
Yeah, so February 24th, Russia invades Ukraine. And at least it seemed initially, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Turkey seems to have played a meaningful role in Ukraine's defense by, among other things, providing Ukraine with very impactful drones that were used against Russian military elements on the ground. Can you just sort of describe how Turkey has approached the Russian invasion of Ukraine since February 24th, because it seems like just a very sort of fascinating and unique position that Turkey finds itself in now, supporting Ukraine's defense while also keeping a very open line to Russian diplomats and Russian entreaties as well.
Turkey has been walking a tightrope since the beginning of the war. So many analysts, including myself, have described this position as a balancing act, given Turkey's relations both with NATO and with Russia. Still, you're absolutely right. Turkey has defined the conflict in Ukraine as war pretty early on, which means that it was able to enact the Montreux Treaty of the Straits. And by declaring...
What's the Montreux Treaty of the Straits?
Sure. So this was one of the foundational treaties of the Republic of Turkey, and it gave essentially Turkey the right to control the Straits. And one of these...
the Straits leading from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea.
Right, exactly. So the two straits, the Bosphorus connects Black Sea to Marmara Sea, and then the Dardanelles connect the Marmara Sea to the Mediterranean. And so that's Russia's easiest way of crossing the Black Sea and connect to the Mediterranean. And so the Montreux Treaty states that if there is a war, the Turkey has a right to close the straits to outbound battleships. And so in this case, Turkey was able to, and which it did, close the straits to outbound Russian battleships. That was another way in which Turkey was able to curtail Russian activity. It also provided the Bayraktar TB2 drones that you've mentioned to Ukraine early on in the conflict. These are cheap, and they proved to be extremely effective, helping Ukraine achieve some of those early gains, both tactically and psychologically, boosting the morale of the international community and the Ukrainians, obviously, for a more positive outcome. But obviously, these are these activities and these kinds of gestures of support are now being undone, you might say, by Turkey's position in NATO and Turkey's resistance against NATO expansion. On the other hand, Turkey did not close its airspace to Russian aircrafts, unlike many European allies and partners, nor did it impose any economic sanctions for obvious reasons that I just talked about. Russia is a major trade partner. Turkey therefore has been playing this balancing act, supporting Ukraine where it can, but also making sure that it doesn't antagonize Russia any further through not engaging in the sanctions regime or closing airspace.
To what extent does Erdogan and the Turkish foreign policy elite consider themselves potentially like interlocutors between Russia and the West? I mean, it seemed early on that they were trying to use Turkish good offices, if that is an expression that could be used, to facilitate some sort of cessation of hostilities. That obviously never happened. But now it seems that Turkey is playing an actual meaningful role in this UN-led effort to try to get some of the grain and food that's stuck in Ukrainian ports out to the rest of the world. What do you know about those efforts and Turkish diplomacy more broadly during this period?
Right. So Turkey has tried to play the mediator role in these regional conflicts for a long time during the AKP rule. So this is not the first time that Turkey is stepping up to the plate and saying, let us mediate. The country tried to do that between Israel and Palestine back in early 2000s. That was not fruitful. Same with the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and now more recently between Ukraine and Russia. And you're absolutely right. There were some early efforts to bring the parties to the table to call a ceasefire and possibly resolve the conflict, but that kind of died down. And right now there are ongoing talks to facilitate the shipment of Ukraine's agricultural exports, grain specifically, because we're expecting a major global food crisis later this year and well into the next year. And Turkey offers to be basically a corridor, right? So the Odessa port is right now closed. The proposal suggests that the Odessa port will open, and then the shipments will pass through Turkey to get to some of these developing countries that normally get Ukraine's grains. But here, both Kiev and Moscow have their own demands, which also pushes Turkey into a difficult policy corner. So essentially, Turkey constantly finds itself in these difficult policy corners. One of the things that I think is interesting is that Ukraine, for a while, wasn't formally invited to the talks. So the negotiations about how to draft the plan and how to operationalize it were taking place between Turkey and Russia. So the proposed deal includes a couple of demands from each of the actors, and that's why it's very difficult for them to resolve this. Russia, in return for opening and allowing the port of Odessa to operate, wants the sanctions on its own farm exports to be lifted, and also wants the port of Odessa to be demined. And finally, it wants to have the ability to inspect the ships that go to Ukraine. That's obviously a major no-no for Ukraine. Ukraine rejects these conditions and wants to ensure that opening the Black Sea port, the port of Odessa, does not allow Russia to either inspect its own ships that are going into Ukraine, but also prevents Russia from exerting greater control in the region at the expense of its own security. Like you said, the UN supports this proposal, and Turkey expects that it will endorse the plan. And if it does, that should give Ukraine much greater confidence in the deal's intentions and credibility. But of course, it's difficult for anyone, and most importantly, Ukraine and the Ukrainians, to isolate Turkey's efforts there from its very frustrating resistance to NATO engagement, NATO enlargement. And so it's very difficult to isolate Turkey's different activities in these different dimensions and different stages, and not consider them in relation to one another.
So lastly, on this question of NATO, we are speaking about 7 days ahead of a major NATO meeting in Madrid. It was expected, months ago, when Sweden and Finland first made their intentions known about their desire to join NATO, that this would be like a swift process. And, as we discussed, Erdogan, for domestic political reasons, is putting the brakes on this process. Is there anything you suspect that the international community might offer to Turkey to nudge it away from its position of intransigence right now?
Right. Some of the recent developments happening at NATO and the Secretary General's office show that they are really trying hard to make Turkey happy. So about 2 weeks ago, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, expressed that Turkey's concerns about terrorism were legitimate and that they must be addressed. Importantly, if you watch his press briefing, he corrects himself twice, like mid-sentence, calling the country Turkey instead of Turkey. And if you go to NATO's official website now, Turkey is now listed as Turkey on the list of members.
What's the significance of that?
So these are hat tips to the Turkish government's current PR effort to change the country's official name from Turkey to what it's known in Turkey itself. In Turkish, it's called Türkiye, so that it's not synonymous with poultry in the English language. And so you could tell that Stoltenberg was trying really hard to, he says Turkey and then he corrects himself and goes Türkiye.
If that is a concession, I say go for it.
Right, exactly. But then, these are some of the very little sort of low-hanging fruits for NATO to pick. But then some allies are getting frustrated. So Emmanuel Macron, French president, is asking NATO to sort of find out about Turkey's real intentions and clarifying Turkey's positions. So clearly there is some expectation to bring this to a happy ending at the NATO summit, a happy conclusion at the NATO summit in Madrid. And then when you turn to Germany, German foreign minister says that, obviously everybody wanted Finland and Sweden to join NATO in the Madrid summit later this month, actually as soon as next week. But then Annalena Baerbock, German foreign minister, said that it wouldn't be a catastrophe if this doesn't conclude in the Madrid summit. And then when you turn to Turkey, Turkish officials say very confidently, because they have all the leverage in the world, saying that, we don't consider the Madrid conference as the Madrid summit as a deadline for these negotiations, and we're going to take for as long as we need to make sure that everybody's on the same page and Turkey is given some guarantees. Now, what those guarantees will look like, again, we can only speculate, and we can only speculate what Turkey will consider to be a win and where would compromises take place.
So what are you looking towards in the coming weeks that suggest to you whether or not Erdogan relents on his opposition to NATO membership for Sweden and Finland?
So Erdogan wants concessions, right? Guarantees that he can then take home and say the Turks won. He always wants to assert Turkey on the international stage, and so whatever he can take, he will sell this to their sort of possible maximum at home. It could be, like I said, a combination of written guarantees, condemnation of terrorism, or tangible outcomes such as the lifting of arms embargoes. We know that, for instance, Sweden is revising its counterterrorism legislation and finding out ways to redesign regulations on export bans so that Turkey can be off the hook. And some of a lot of people are arguing or expecting or hypothesizing, I guess, that Turkey might also be trying to get some concessions from the U.S., such as being put back on the F-35 list, which Turkey was kicked off after it purchased the S-400s. And so Erdogan and the Turkish delegation in NATO know that they have a lot of leverage, like I said, and they are not afraid to go to the edge of the cliff, so to speak, to get whatever they can. If your listeners might remember, he's done it before in the EU back in early 2000s to get the membership negotiations to start when he had a lot less leverage. So he knows that he can do this again. And we'll see what plays out next week in Madrid. And the next couple of weeks after that will be even more interesting.
Well, Sibel, thank you so much. This was so helpful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Sibel Oktay. That was very helpful and timely. We recorded this conversation, as I mentioned, just a few days ahead of that major NATO meeting in Madrid, though. Even if you have listened to this episode in the weeks since, I think it nonetheless gives you really important context for understanding Turkish foreign policy. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.